very warm welcome here from the University of Victoria. My name is Oliver Schmidt. I'm directing the Center for Global Study that hosts this event, and I feel honored and thrilled to welcome you all to the Canadian launch of the book, Socially Responsible Higher Education, International Perspectives on Knowledge Democracy. And the Center for Global Studies here at UVic is delighted to be part of this conversation on the role of higher education and the role it can play in fostering the democratization of knowledge and strengthening of a democratic culture. Before we start off, however, let me acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Misanish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. And this land acknowledgement draws attention already to one of the fundamental challenges that our democracy currently has to tackle. And I'm sure we will hear about the role of the universities addressing the legacy of colonialism, past injustices, and the treatment of Indigenous peoples in the book launch that we are about to embark on now. With this, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Kathy Krull, who has some opening remarks for you as well. Dr. Krull is a professor in the Department of Sociology and UVic Special Advisor in International Affairs. And prior to joining UVic in 2014, she was a professor of Sociology and Cultural Studies at Queen's University. And over the past years, Dr. Krull's research has focused on different dimensions of Cuban society, as well as family and reproductive policies in Canada, with a strong emphasis on Aboriginal issues as well. So with this, Kathy, I hand it over to you, and please take it away.
Thank you, Oliver. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm a guest on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples, and I'm incredibly grateful for the privilege to work and play on these beautiful lands. I'm so delighted today to get to welcome you to the book launch, Socially Responsible Higher Education, International Perspectives on Knowledge Democracy, co-edited by UNESCO chairs Dr. Budhall and Rajesh Tandon. This book, I think, is so much more than a collection of theoretical reflections from thought experts on knowledge democracy. Rather, it is a timely, perhaps even long past due, call to actions for higher education. Budhall and Rajesh Tandon begin their book by posing a question to us. Is the university contributing to our global crisis, or does it offer stories of hope? In other words, they query the purpose of higher education in society. As they argue, if the futures of education are to promote universal learning to become, then education has to be seen as serving the public and the well-being of humanity as a whole. In this refresh lies the seed for reimagining socially responsible higher education, both locally and globally. The emphasis of the book is on how we can collectively address the most challenging problems of the world, as it's going to take all forms of knowledge, not just science alone, to make the necessary changes. For me, the value of the book lies not only in its calls to action, but also in the practical examples that are presented through the various chapters. As an academic leader here at UVic, I believe that this book provides a blueprint for where higher education needs to go and must go. The book offers us tools for co-creating multiple modes of inquiry, multiple sources of knowledge generation and dissemination, all of which is necessary to realize social responsibility and make changes towards the good of all humanity. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our very first speaker and co-editor of the book, Bud Hall. Bud is Professor Emeritus with the School of Public Administration and co-chair of the UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education. This is located in the Center for Global Studies. And Rajesh is also a UNESCO chair and is with the Society for Participatory Research in Asia, PRIA, in New Delhi, India. The objective of the UNESCO Chair is to build research capacity in the Global South and the excluded North in the field of community-based research. It does this through collaboration with many global networks, through advocacy work with governments and funding bodies, through training. As an accomplished leader in community-based research and knowledge democracy, Bud is widely published with numerous articles and books. Please welcome UNESCO Chair, Professor Bud Hall.
Okay, thank you, thanks. It occurred to me that this is an ideal group to be launching this, because with Andrew and Kathy and Oliver and Tamara and Katherine and Baptiste and Jody, Stephanie, Neva, and so forth, all of you have been, either for quite a long time, people like Andrew and myself, or a shorter time, have been active advocates, pioneers, spokespeople for the question of not only socially responsible higher education, but for some really remarkable developments in this field. So, as I talk a little bit about this book, remember that it comes out of, it floats in this community of which all of you are part. So it's and that's Rajesh and I see our role as trying to articulate some of the ideas and the experiences that many of you have been involved in over quite a few years. So the book is we worked on this book for about 2.5 years. And basically, we wanted to make a contribution to, right at this point in time, to thinking about what an inclusive, recovery for a post-pandemic might look like. We want to address the question of how do we prepare young professionals so that they are open to, they are not only young professionals, but they're open to the big issues of the day, and to the responsibilities of citizenship. We also, as Kathy has alluded to, we're also, and Oliver, we also realize that our ability as humanity to address the global challenges needs to be done from a broader base of knowledge than simply the historic, European knowledge base. And we also are interested in supporting the production of locally contextualized knowledge in the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have our approach to social responsibility is can be, we've got kind of 4 areas that we focused on in the book, and these are lessons that we've drawn from the various case studies. Is the importance of community engaged teaching. And that means linking teaching, research, and engagement, not seeing them as separate worlds, but bringing coherence in higher education to the teaching, research, and engagement roles. We believe in place-based. In other words, the curriculum, the contextualized curriculum in British Columbia is going to be different from that in New Delhi, or that in England, and that attention to that is terribly important. We believe in obviously in the development of rigorous, robust structures to support community-based research partnerships, and we're particularly interested in the inclusion of linguistic and cultural diversity, so that universities will think of themselves as not only drawing on epistemologies, multiple epistemologies, but the cultural diversity of those parts of the world where they are located, and also on the languages, so that we may operate in English here in British Columbia, but we should also be vigorously supporting the recovery, in our case, of Indigenous languages and multilingual kind of higher education. Looks really important to us. The book. All of our work, by the way, is open access, free and open access. We're quite passionate about making everything we do available to anybody. It won't be stopped because they can't afford it. So same thing with this book. And there's a picture of Rajesh and myself, and people can download the book for free right there. And with that, I will stop and turn it back to Kathy.
Thank you, Bud. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Tamara Kroczenko. She's an assistant professor in the School of Public Administration and a member of the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems at the University of Victoria. Dr. Kroczenko is an expert in comparative public policy and regional development. She has conducted comparative public policy research in over a dozen countries and has authored over 50 articles, books, and reports. As a policy analyst specializing in regional development at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, she advised governments on a range of topics, including rural policy in Poland, regional development in Greece, Kazakhstan, Sweden, the governance of land use in the Czech Republic, France, the Netherlands, and Poland, and Indigenous economic development in Canada and Sweden. She has also worked for both federal and provincial governments in Canada and for a number of research institutes and universities as a professor and a researcher. Welcome, Tamara.
Thank you. Shall I present? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Katherine. It's a pleasure to meet you too. And very nice to see everyone. So I'm sharing, Bud and Rajesh, I just want to thank you. I mean, Rajesh isn't on the call, but for your leadership on this book. I think it's a fantastic volume, and I love seeing all the different chapters with the different countries represented. And the chapter that I contributed to together with Zalina Enikieva and with Bogdan Kroczenko is about Kyrgyzstan. And you'll notice that my name, Kroczenko, is the same name as Kroczenko. So my father is the director of graduate studies, dean of graduate studies at the University of Central Asia, and has lived in Central Asia for around 15 years. And I've always been involved in that university and spent a lot of time there. So I care a lot about Kyrgyzstan. And in the chat function, I wonder if anyone here has been to Kyrgyzstan and has visited it. Do let me know. It's a beautiful place to visit. So I'll just share some of the highlights from our assessment of how Kyrgyzstan is delivering on socially responsible education. Kyrgyzstan, it's a low-income Central Asian country, so it's a small population as well, 6.4 million. And it borders on China, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. It's a landlocked country, if you're not familiar with it. And it inherited its educational infrastructure largely from the USSR, including really a system of social and spatial stratification. And it's been quite challenging to overcome that. And so the fate of the Kyrgyz has been intertwined with Soviet colonialism. And when the country established independence in 1991, that was a real possibility to change change the agenda and really reform education. And as I'll describe, there's been a quick rollout and it hasn't entirely been intentional. So under the Soviet era, there were large investments in education, but they didn't readily benefit the Kyrgyz population. In particular, jobs were controlled by Moscow, and jobs disproportionately went to settlers in the Republic at that time. And The development of a broad university system, particularly a research-oriented university system that served the needs of Kyrgyzstan, was not much of a priority. And come to sort of what happened in 1991 when Kyrgyzstan became an independent state and inherited these Soviet structures, it was then time to think about what education, what the university sector could be in that society. And in general, there was just sort of a liberalization, and they allowed any number of foreign entities to come in, a large number of universities to start up, such that there are, I think, around 51 institutes of higher education for a population of under 7 million, if you can believe it. And there hasn't been a great deal of attention to the quality of those institutions. And so they really expanded enrollments, they introduced things very quickly, and there wasn't thinking a lot about graduate outcomes or labor market demand. And also as a low-income country, there's very little spending on education, including higher education. And so many of these universities do charge a fee. However, that fee is quite low. And in order to get students, they cannot invest in programs that have capital and capital investments that are costly in terms of the types of instruments you might have to access. All of this leads to a sort of a mismatch. So if you look at graduates by field of study, you would almost think that Kyrgyzstan is in this parallel universe. So a country of 6 million people has 5,600 law graduates. Imagine that. 13,000 students have completed economics and management programs, and yet there are hardly any businesses to manage. That's not how their economy is structured. Agriculture is the largest employer in the country, and universities graduate just 300 students in agriculture and veterinary sciences every single year. So there's a big mismatch in terms of what is needed and what is happening. And where graduates are coming out, they tend to be so mismatched in the fields that they're poorly trained and effectively unemployable without significant retraining. And we have surveys from different employers to demonstrate this. So a lack of qualified personnel is really critically blocking the potential of the country. Moreover, universities are underfunded, and they certainly breed corruption. And so when you think about what is the basic social responsibility of universities, they have this urgency to provide human capital required to progress society and the economy, but they're also places that should really nurture informed and compassionate citizens. And today, most of the institutions in Kyrgyzstan, I think we can safely say they're not doing that, and they're really breeding grounds of cynicism. And it's a sad commentary that a recent survey found that majority of students basically say that the goal of education is just to get a diploma, not to understand knowledge or skills or know-how. Now, we're very potentially biased in writing this article and highlighting the mission of the University of Central Asia, but I really do think it's been quite an internationally recognized institution that's delivering, I think, effective and socially responsible and culturally relevant education in the region. So the University of Central Asia really tries to promote the social and economic development of Central Asia as a whole. And they have campuses not just in Kyrgyzstan, but in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, also in Afghanistan. And they don't just have campuses across these places. They have campuses in the most remote, least accessible, and poorest regions that have been the most marginalized. It is a development project. Moreover, they convene students from across these territories that have so typically been isolated from one another. That isolation stems from just not knowing one another's cultures, languages, and identity, to even the fact that Central Asian countries barely trade with one another. They trade about 6% of their economies trade with one another. So I think in our article, we really do highlight the potential of a model like UCA to deliver, enable people from the region to preserve their rich and cultural heritage and assets for the future, and to know one another, and to deliver responsive education that's grounded in what's happening in those places. So it is a university whose programs are often flexible, low cost, target people from regions that are more marginalized, that for which there are more territorial disparities, and to really deliver something that will lead to strong outcomes and will create employment, because there just simply aren't jobs often for young people. So they're also kind of making them entrepreneurial and so on. It's very hard to separate education from the politics in the region. Kyrgyzstan has been a nascent democracy, but in the last, year really, with the new president coming in, there are major changes that are tarnishing that are rolling back the constitution, and you know, it's challenging to think about what the future might look right now. And yet there are, I think, a coalescing number of actors that are really pushing for the potential of stronger educational reforms and for a more responsive educational sector. I think that the diagnosis of the problems is very evident. We have examples of strong leadership from institutions like the UCA, and hopefully there will be a way path forward in the future. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tamara. Now I'd like to introduce Katherine Derry. Katherine is a third-year doctoral candidate with the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa in Canada. She recently completed a career transition to the world of academia after serving 25 years as a military officer with the Canadian Armed Forces. Her latest master research project pertained to the radicalization of students in Canadian universities. Her current research efforts focus on the socialization of graduate students to the scholarly profession. She is the recipient of the University of Guelph Alumni with Impact Award and the Royal Canadian Military Institute Dr. Robert J. Farrelly Prize. Welcome.
So as mentioned during the introduction, I'm Katherine, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa. I'm the author of Chapter 17, discussing how to prevent the radicalization of university students. I thought that I would take a few seconds to explain why I decided to write this chapter. 2 years ago, I retired from the military after 25 years of service, during which I deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq on counterterrorism operations. It was during my last mission that I came across a demographic report on foreign recruits joining Daesh. That was the prevailing terrorist group at the time. So in 2016, then the World Bank was reporting that the average age of foreign fighters was 27 years old, and that 25% of them had university level education. So I thought that these stats were fascinating. So as my research project for my master's in education, I decided to explore the triggers that motivate university students to radicalize. In Chapter 17, I do discuss some of these triggers, such as knowledge accessibility and dissemination on university grounds. That is actually in line with the UNESCO report dated 2015, revealing that recruiters from terrorist groups were targeting post-secondary institutions. With this in mind, I raised the question of university social responsibility toward students exposed to knowledge deemed radical in nature and their ensuing transformation of perspectives, potentially threatening democracy. And I used the model from Reiser with 4 axes of change for a socially responsible university that are knowledge, participation, education, and organization. Looking at different initiatives implemented by universities across the world, I discuss how prevention measures fit within those 4 axes. For example, under the knowledge axis, a UNESCO chair on the prevention of radicalization and violent extremism was integrated in 2018 at the Université de Sherbrooke in Canada. So this research chair certainly contributes to knowledge, especially with their recently launched Prevention Impact Project that aims at developing evaluation models for primary, secondary, and tertiary education programs preventing violent extremism. Under the participation axis, the Université de Liège in Belgium published an information guide for families suspecting students of radicalization, offering readily available resources. So providing information to the community at large, not just on university grounds. Under the education axis, the United Kingdom strategy called PREVENT encourages educational staff to refer possible cases of student radicalization. However, that specific policy has been criticized for impeding academic freedom by stigmatizing cultural groups and also securitizing higher education. And finally, under the organization axis, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland systematically assesses risks with external speakers coming to university and also events while maintaining its commitment to freedom of thoughts and expression. So from a historical standpoint, individuals have generally acted in pacific ways to further their causes, even if their ideologies were considered radical at times. It is really when individuals and groups of individuals adopt and use violence to reach political, religious, and social objectives that it becomes a problem. I do believe that universities have a social responsibility to develop strategies to not only prevent, but also react and reverse radicalized cases emerging from their student population, all the while preserving fundamental democratic values and principles of academic freedom. And I know it's not an easy task. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you will enjoy reading my chapter and the rest of the book as well.
Thank you, Katherine. Our next speaker is Baptiste Gaudry, who's an associate professor at the School of Social Work at the Université de Sherbrooke. His research focuses on social inequalities, social participation, and production of knowledge. His work is based on the idea that the recognition and production of knowledge are the products of systemic inequalities and oppressions that structure social relations. He also co-directs the working group 21 Diversity of Knowledge of a French-speaking international sociological association. Several of the research projects in which he participated and participates currently are based on participatory methodologies with users, patient, activists, health and social services professionals, and researchers. In 2020, he has co-edited a book called Decolonizing Social Sciences, a bilingual anthology of texts of Orlando Falls Borda, Science and Common Good publisher. So welcome, Baptiste.
Thank you very much, Katherine. I'm very glad to be here with you for this event. In fact, Bud invited me to speak on behalf of Florence Piron, who tragically passed away very lately. It's a huge loss for the fight for cognitive justice in the academia. So I'm here to talk about the chapters her and Tom, Yvonne, Ina, and Zachary wrote in the book, and they contributed to 2 chapters in this book. And I chose to present the general argument of the one of the 2 chapters, chapter 6. It's a chapter based on the idea that we need a radical change for radical change from the current system of metrics and rankings for articles and journals. In this chapter, they deconstruct the quality argument that states that quality is guaranteed by the current system of metrics and rankings. And they suggest to move on from this current system to a system that includes 2 dimensions, which are social responsibility and social relevance. This chapter really captures and deconstructs the knowledge-based economy we're living in, and its downside for the whole academic life. The knowledge-based economy is the result of a process of commodification of knowledge. I'm sure you're all used to this process. That is to say, after a selection process, articles are published in journals and then belongs to a publisher who sells and rents it. And this conception of scientific production raises at least two challenges. First of all, in the knowledge-based economy, openness mainly means open access to scientific publications and open data in order to fasten the scientific process and scientific collaborations. But in many cases, it's a limited conception of open access, only limited to scholars and students, mostly from the global north, who can access these articles through their universities. And to fight this inequality, this chapter raises awareness about the benefits of a real open access politics, including the use of Creative Commons licenses for books and articles. The second challenge, in order to move beyond this knowledge-based economy, is the challenge of the value of metrics and rankings. You all know, I assume, academia and ResearchGate's platforms and statistics, and the 5 major publishers who are driven by indicators. One of the most famous one is the impact factor, and these quantitative indicators have been used to measure the quality of the knowledge produced. For example, to rank scientific journals, to analyze the publication track records of academics, and even to judge their merits for promotion and access to research grants. These indicators are increasingly criticized nowadays from within the academia because of many reasons. I would just mention 2. They don't say anything about the quality of the article, and because they are unfair. Unfair because journals from the global south barely or never, even never have any chance of being recognized by American English language databases. This chapter ends with a very radical proposal of a solution to these 2 challenges I've mentioned. And this proposal is a polycentric plurilingual system of publication. In this polycentric plurilingual system of publication, every language community would elaborate their own quality assessment system for their journals according to their contexts and their research concerns or disciplines, etc. So it's basically a call for scholars around the world to start by abandoning the current Northern assessment criteria and to develop their own contextualized criteria for science and publishing. Florence and her colleagues state that this work should be accompanied by contextualized system of research evaluation and affordable sharing of knowledge through open source, for example, open source online based journal or platforms not owned or controlled by for-profit publishers. I hope this gave you a little taste to go into the details of this argumentation. They also co-signed a chapter, which is chapter 22, where they discuss 4 cases, case studies. I guess I remember it's Latin America, in Western Africa, and in Quebec, illustrating this polycentric, pluralistic conception of knowledge and its difficulties. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baptiste. And now I'm really pleased to introduce you to our discussant today. Our discussant is Andrew Petter, the former president and vice chancellor of Simon Fraser University and professor in its School of Public Policy. Prior to joining SFU in 2010, he was professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria, where he served as dean from 2001 to 2008. From 1991 to 2001, he served as a member of the Legislative Assembly of the Province of British Columbia and held numerous cabinet portfolios, including advanced education, intergovernmental relations, and attorney general. An advocate for higher education, locally and nationally, Andrew worked with partners across Canada to encourage post-secondary institutions to serve as anchor institutions, contributing to the social, economic, cultural, and environmental well-being of their communities. Welcome, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Kathy. And it's just a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with my old buddy, Bud. We've been co-conspirators on this agenda for many years in different fora at times, but always working in tandem. And to see this book come out, which you, Kathy, I think correctly described as a call to action, I think is really heartening. It's one of many Bud's calls to action, but hopefully the calls are also accompanied by progress. I also really want to thank the three presenters today. I will confess a little, I'm not sure it's a conflict of interest, but a mutual interest with Tamara, because I sit on the board of the University of Central Asia. I was just appointed recently, so I am learning a lot about some of the work of that university, one of the Aga Khan's sponsored universities in Central Asia, and really was interested, Tamara, in your article and your co-authors, which helped to further illuminate me on the mission that that university has and that I'm hoping to contribute to on the board. But also to Katherine and Matisse for your presentation on behalf of Florence and others. I'm not going to comment on the specific papers that were here today. They are representative of a very rich and diverse set of papers in this volume that Bud and Rajesh have brought together to really awaken us and remind us and encourage us to move forward with this agenda. But I thought I'd reflect a little bit on the agenda, because I do think it's important for us to remind ourselves some of the obstacles and some of the challenges that lie before us, those of us who believe that universities can and must be part of the solution and not part of the problem, and are committed to trying to answer the call to action that Bud and Rajesh have consistently put in front of us and put in front of us again. Because it really is a rather radical idea, and I mean radical in the positive sense that Katherine referred to when she quoted Raymond Williams. That's radicalism as a way of making hope possible. But it really is a radical idea to think that universities will be instruments for social progress and social betterment when you consider the history of universities. I mean, universities historically, even before the enclosure movement took place that we're all familiar with historically, where common property was seized and brought under the control of private interests, universities, even before that, were enclaves. Enclaves in which knowledge was kept tightly held, in which truths were spoken amongst elites, and they were very much about the preservation of certain kinds of epistemologies, be they religious or be they the epistemologies of certain elites within jurisdictions. So the history of universities is one that really runs very much counter to the agenda that Bud and I and others on this session want universities to be real agents of change and not be instruments of the status quo. But I think we need to remind ourselves that this is a radical proposition. We're really calling upon an institution that in the past has served a very, very different role. Now, having said that, I believe universities and higher education institutions generally can play a very positive role. And I think this volume tells us, and Bud's introduction and conclusion also very nicely frame what that role can be. But I also want to draw attention to, and I don't want to be totally negative about this, but I really think it's important that we be aware of how our efforts can be appropriated and misdirected, because I see it happening quite often. Baptiste mentioned on behalf of the paper he talked about this knowledge of research impact. I mean, if you talk to someone on the street about research impact, they would be forgiven for thinking you're talking about the impact research has on society, the impact it has in improving social conditions. And yet within academe, research impact has conventionally meant publication impact. In other words, how many times your article is cited by others, which, as the article Baptiste reported on, creates a particular view of the university that isn't necessarily consistent. So even the term impact has been appropriated here in a very attenuated and selective way. I'm very concerned about how the whole theme of community engagement is appropriated. I see many universities that are, as was pointed out in the volume, I think in the introduction, many universities are highlighting community engagement, not just as a third priority, but as something that is more fundamental in what they do. But I also am aware that many universities are doing that to try to gain social license. They're doing it very much for instrumental reasons that are about improving their position within their community or within their jurisdiction. I'm not convinced as many as I would like to see, and I'm sure all of us would like to see, are doing it because they really believe in the project. And I think we have to be aware of that, and we have to push them. And those within universities have to push administrators, as I have been pushed when I have been an administrator, to make sure that this isn't just an exercise in public relations or self-aggrandizement. I'm very worried about terminology. I'm worried about the way in which terms like decolonization are used and bandied about in universities. Decolonization is not simply the university acknowledging that there are indigenous sources of knowledge, but decolonization, if it means anything, must mean taking those sources of knowledge seriously and integrating them and viewing them as important sources of knowledge, as this volume calls upon us to do. But I see the word used a lot in ways that I don't think really are speaking to that deeper meaning and that deeper radical agenda. And similarly with alternative epistemologies. Yes, universities are reaching out and talking to communities and listening, but the epistemologies that they tend to privilege tend to be somewhat selective. I think, Tamara, you talked about in University of Central Asia, how Soviet epistemologies have been privileged historically within that region. And of course, Eurocentric epistemologies have dominated hugely within universities in North America and Europe. So we just need to be careful that people aren't appropriating the words that we use with a particular meaning and purpose and radical agenda to simply try to improve or neutralize. Worse still, neutralize what people are doing. Now, let me give you my example that I will be ashamed to say I participated in this example, although I was reluctant the first year. SDGs, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, very important goals, and Bud, you rightly referenced them as important indicators of social progress. But what's happened in terms of universities' progress on SDGs? A major rating service, Times Higher Education, has developed a ranking system around social development goals. And many of us, even those of us who were reluctant in the first year, succumbed to the temptation to participate in the second year. And I just went back this morning just to check it out, because there's a new version that came out just a couple of weeks ago. Guess how many of the top 20 universities in the ranking that Times Higher Education does of universities that are delivering on social development goals come from the global south? Well, you're right, none. I can tell you 3 come from Europe, 5 from the United Kingdom, 4 from Canada, the United States, and Australia, New Zealand came through actually with an impressive number of 8. But they all came from universities that are well-resourced, universities who have the luxury of pursuing positive environmental and social agendas because they have the kinds of resources that allow them to do that. And they have the kind of resources to fill out questionnaires and satisfy Times Higher Education that they are in fact doing great things. So I think this is a pretty powerful example of what we're up against. So I don't want to discourage people, because I'm not discouraged at all. I believe a lot of progress is being made. I think this volume and the work that Bud and Rajesh is doing and the work that we're all doing is important. But I also wanted to send a cautionary note that we need to be careful that our work is not being misdirected or misused, that we hold to account those who are embracing certain terminology or certain rankings or certain views on community engagement or knowledge democracy, to make sure that they're pursuing it with purpose, and that purpose is consistent with the goals that Rajesh, Bud, and all of you have so clearly set out in this volume.
Thank you, Andrew. I underline so much of what you've just said, and goes back to my point too, that I think, principles, you have to be very clear of the principles that are framing any of the initiatives that you're trying to do. But this brings us to the end of our speakers, and I like to thank each one of them very much. And now we get to focus on the participants. So we look forward to hearing your questions and comments. If you can use the chat line, that would be great. If you would prefer, we will try to look at the hand icon on the Zoom line. So please go ahead. I think we may even have some already. We have a lot of comments, but I don't see any questions yet. And do we have any?
Kathy, maybe I could quick follow up for Andrew. Andrew, you've been in a position of a university president, and at a university that claims, I think, for very legitimate reasons, to be a leader in community engagement and so forth. So what do you see as effective steps of changing the culture at a university to open up, this space for genuine, radical community engagement? Is there something that stands out for you that really changes? Is it acknowledgement of what faculty members do, for their portfolio? Is it funding? I'm just wondering if you had some advice for us, when it comes to supporting community engagement from an administrative position. What can a university do? Maybe we can think through this first. What really has worked for you in the 10 years, that you've been on the helm of Simon Fraser on this front?
Well, I don't profess to have any magic formula, but I think it won't surprise you, I don't think, Oliver, by what I say, but I think it's very much the chemistry between an administration that is supportive of this agenda, and is prepared to validate faculty members and students who want to pursue this radical agenda in a positive way. And to move those students and those faculty members and administrators who share that agenda more to the center of the university in terms of its value system. So I think embedding this commitment in the core strategic planning of the university, this is obviously, it would be completely contradictory to think that this can be driven by administration or in a hierarchical manner. It can't. It would be antithetical to the whole theory and purpose. But I think historically, and Bud, you and I might identify with this back at UVic in the day, people who were pushing this were we were given encouragement, but we were very much on the periphery of the discussion within the institution. And I think one thing that university administrators can do, if they're committed to this, is to change that and to celebrate the mission to highlight success, and it has a big impact on others within the university. I mean, one very instrumental example of that is, of course, around what counts for tenure and promotion. I believe faculty members still care about that. And we know that in addition to rankings, the way in which many disciplines continue to rank progress is by peer-reviewed publications in elite journals. Well, that carries a message which is fairly conservative. And even if faculty members are deeply committed to trying to have social impact, the focus that they put on trying to get into those elite journals can be very time consuming. So there have been significant shifts in that in many disciplines in terms of trying to value different forms of research. I think in Canada, the importance of Indigenous knowledge and research with respect to Indigenous peoples and co-creation of knowledge with Indigenous peoples, I think has put pressure on universities and on disciplines to recognize that there are alternative ways of measuring that success. But I go beyond that. I think it's really important for the universities to find ways to value those people who are engaging in social development in various forms, and that includes administration. I think by staff and things. So I think the university has to walk the walk. It has to use its financial resources. It has to use its procurement policies. It has to show that it is committed to trying to use all of its resources, not only its academic resources in terms of teaching and research, but also its physical resources, its financial resources, in a way that is trying to help advance social, environmental goals. And easier said than done. And I certainly wouldn't pretend that that SFU, has gone nearly far enough. But I think we made some headway in that way.
Thank you, Andrew. That's great advice, and I think I can fully subscribe to just what you said. And also, the devil's in the details sometimes. When you try to do this, to change a culture, it takes many steps, and it is multifaceted, and how we need to really integrate community engagement into our portfolio of teaching, of research, and so on. Kathy, do you have still one moment, or do you want to move on? Do we have other questions?
No, we have a moment if you want, and then I've got some questions.
Because I can also turn to Bud now and ask, Bud, you work in this fabulous international community of scholars and community leaders with PRIA and so forth. What have you seen? What has worked, maybe also outside of our Canadian world here, that you would say, look, these are fabulous examples of how a university can change, and how the relationship between an academic scholarly community and communities out there in civil society can be rethought from I like the idea of Andrew, from this radical perspective.
Well, thanks for the question, Oliver, and thank you, Andrew, for your reflections. As you say, you and I were at UVic in trying to get these ideas, onto the table. It took us quite a while to get it. So one thing I would say is that persistence and time are really important. When I began my early work in community-based research was way back in 72 and 73. I never was allowed to teach a course, even teach a course called that, till 1989, and there wasn't any funding for that kind of work in Canada till 1998, and there weren't any. The only structure that supported this kind of thing was at UQAM, which got started with its service aux collectivités in the late 1970s, and yet now there's hardly a university in Canada that doesn't have some kind of structure to support, engagement. Now, I agree fully with Andrew that all of the words, anything that we say can be co-opted. When Rajesh and I first started working around, we said, well, let's, around socially responsible research, we said, well, let's give it a different name and we'll define it. And so anybody who uses that name, they'll have to go by our definition. So we made in 1975 a list of principles, and we called, so anybody who uses that concept of participatory research, it's a new concept, it's got its own definition, so we'll know that these are the good people. Well, it didn't take very long. And people who were attracted to that idea, and it became very fundable, particularly in the NGO world. So everybody was using it, and using it sometimes very badly. So persistence and having a long-term view. It's taken hundreds of years for the kind of Eurocentric structure of knowledge to really have its hold, and it's going to take hundreds, I don't know, but it's going to be long term. It'll be long past my being here on the planet to see the real difference. But change is underway. The second thing that Rajesh and I have done as a strategy is try to make these kinds of trends look like, try to, how can I say this? I try to give, shine a big light on these kinds of ideas that might be, as Andrew was saying, very marginal. But what we have done over the years is we have tried to, through case studies, through the books like the current one, is try to illustrate that, in fact, in small ways and large ways, change is happening. Here's all the different places where they're happening, and those kinds of studies, policy, policy documents based on that kind of thing are attractive to administrators. University administrators are very happy to support, innovative work, as long as it's not too innovative or too expensive. And you can't transform a whole university if it looks like you're the only university in the world doing it. But the fact that Andrew was able to go as far as he was at SFU was because there was and there is a genuine movement around engagement, in the world. Now, it hasn't reached, to the degree of kind of radical restructuring of the university that some of us might imagine, but it is one of the areas of contestation within higher education. And anything that we can do to shine a light on the fact that these things are happening, not just in Victoria, not just in Sherbrooke, not just in Central Asia, but in all over the place, makes university administrators feel, we want to be part of this movement. Not all universities are, as Andrew would know so well, are spaces of contestation. Every different meeting that you've got, somebody else telling you how to run your place, what your content should be, who the good people are, who the bad people are. And so it's never going to be just the Kathy Crowells or the Baptistes coming to see you. It's going to be it's going to be very angry people, from different sectors who say, oh, your students are, too radical. They're not, they're not career oriented. They're not building this industry or that industry. So forget all that stuff and just do what here's our agenda, and we worked it out, and here, why don't you do this? So, and there are always going to be spaces of contestation. So I think that the important part is to, is to continue to build, always add, to see ourselves as a movement, which we are, and always to be building and adding, and never be shy to give visibility. Never forget that these are important things that we're talking about. Who knows? Maybe they're absolutely critical to the survival of humanity. I don't know, but they're important. And never be shy, or to tell the story, to tell your story, or to allow somebody else to tell the story.
Thank you, Bud. I also think too that one of the things that we are starting to see a change in is the value of community-based and community-engaged research in universities. We're starting to move away from using traditional metrics of success, and really starting to look at the impact of research, and an impact that's not just in terms of traditional marks of success for the researcher or for the university, but in terms of the actual societal or community impact that research has. And so, you know, we've seen this in collective agreements in you know, across numerous universities, where now, you know, we're looking at different types of outcomes of research rather than just journal articles. I think we've still got a ways to go, but we can certainly see that shift. And it comes about because of community-based research. It comes about because of Indigenous research. And I think we've got to embrace those changes to make sure that they get even more entrenched in the ways that we practice things. We've got two questions that I'll get to. The first one that I'll put to the panels and to our discussant, as well as to you, Bud, is, can someone please address the role universities play in creating the problems? Are they part of the problem, or are they the problem?
Well, I think the good news is that they're not the problem, but they are. The bad news is they are definitely potentially part of the problem. I mean, universities are artifacts of society, and they're artifacts that that are very much connected with elite interests within society, be they within government or be within the community. They rely on funding. And while more of that funding is coming through tuition revenue, regrettably, the less funding is coming from government. So there are constraints on universities. We also know that there are huge interests on the part of companies to utilize universities to derive benefit, be it in hiring of students, be it in their research they do, be it in gaining social license. And so universities, to the extent that they provide support for companies that are doing things that we may regard as adverse, be it in terms of their lack of climate commitments or their social practices, universities are helping to enable that. But as Bud said, universities are places of social contestation. So part of the university conversation is about that very role. And how does one as a university that is serving society, how does one at the same time try to help to steer society in a more positive direction? But it would be wrong to suggest that universities are immune from enabling things that happen in society that are deleterious. Universities, in various ways, are contributors to society's problems, but they're also a site for contestation of that very fact. And they also have huge capacity to address those problems and to rectify them. And that contestation and the kind of work that all of us are engaged in, or we wouldn't be on this call, is that much more important for that reason. I'm not sure it's a very good answer, but it's the best I can give.
Thank you, Andrew. Would anybody else like to add? Tamara.
I think one small thing I would add is that the role of universities in territorial development, and in the case of Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia more generally, in the development of kind of national consciousness as well. And I think what I've learned from the University of Central Asia is I think that we have a tendency in many countries to think that all the brains are in the urban areas. That's just not true. And to think more about how universities can, really think about reproducing territorial inequalities through how they operate. And I think that's a challenge to not be part of reproducing that problem. And how do we make universities think more inclusively on a whole number of things, including tackling territorial inequality?
Maybe just add one thing that I didn't mention earlier in answer to Oliver's question that I think is relevant here, and that is student empowerment. I think one of the reasons SFU was more predisposed to fulfilling this role, in addition to having people in faculty and administration, is SFU was one of the first universities in Canada, I think the first, to actually have students on its governance boards. And students, I mean, not all students are necessarily pursuing progressive causes. I wouldn't want to misrepresent that, but I think the energy that students bring to the university, the fact that they have a much greater stake in the future than those of us who are a little older and have less long to live on this earth. The fact that many students retain ideals that others may have abandoned, all of that can really be an engine to push universities in a positive direction if the universities embrace that energy and incorporate it, again, not on a marginal basis, but actually build it into governance structures, on their boards, on their senates, in faculty forums for deliberation and governance.
Thank you, Andrew. Baptiste.
Yeah, thank you. It's not really an answer to the question, but I relate to what Andrew said when, Andrew, you talked about the concern of the appropriation of words, and you mentioned decolonization, impact factor, which are a way to kind of neutralize these terms. And it's a source of concern for me as well, working on processes of co-construction of knowledge, because the acknowledgement of experiential knowledge has become very fashionable from public institutions in the field of social and health services, which is the field I'm working in, but also as well from universities. And the real test for me is, do the community members feel a change? If we as scholars, we acknowledge new epistemologies or historically marginalized knowledge, do the communities who are directly concerned see a difference in the way we do research? It might be in the way they participate in the development of the research, or the orientation of the research program, or the way they benefit from the research. So there's the real world test, which is, do we transform our way of doing research, or is it just we talk about it and there's no real change in our practices? So it's a guideline for me. It's not about having the right way to do it, but it's a guideline. Do the communities who are concerned, they see a difference in the way they experience the research process?
Thanks, Baptiste. Okay, we have another question. In thinking about hope, why should poverty class students have hope, or try to hold on to hope, that anything will change for them and for those who need or should or might come after them in Canadian universities?
I can start this, and I hope others will pick it up. Elaine Laberge, who is asking that question, is one of my doctoral students, and the reason I'm retired, you know, from the university doesn't pay me any longer, so I don't have you know, very many students. I agreed to work with Elaine because of her interest in class and higher education, because she comes from, you know, a generational poverty background, and she's been a passionate advocate of you know, of bringing this question you know, to UVic and to Canadian universities, and in fact is working, you know, with a number of international networks on the issue. I think I've learned from the conversations I've been having and through some of the networks that Elaine has introduced me to. We don't, unlike the UK, which has a strong history, academic history, where class you know, is a very important part of the academic structure, and of course remains very public, you know, as part of the way society is organized. Canada, for a variety of reasons, partly because, you know, we think that, you know, that social mobility is more fluid here, and that class doesn't have the same you know, explanatory power that some other categories have. So we talk a lot about you know, kind of race in the context of of academia. We talk a lot about gender. We talk a lot about sexuality. We talk a lot about different identities, indigenous. But we don't have as much work in Canadian higher education on class. So we don't have the kind of databases. We don't have the evidence-based kind of stories to tell. They sort of get mixed in with everything else. So part of the what I hope may come out of there's new interest in looking at class, and particularly poverty, focused poverty, generational poverty, as a category. I think that's growing, and work is needed in that field, but it's going to take. It's like everything else. It's like with all of us, with all of the different. You with your early work in Cuba, Kathy, or each of us has come with ideas which we thought were presenting kind of radical or at least transformative agendas. Andrew's done it through politics. He's done it through his work on health. He's done it as a higher education. He's done it all over the place. When you start out doing the work, it's pretty lonely. It's pretty lonely. You feel like nobody gives a shit, and nobody's ever. But I think that at least Andrew and I, who are, I'm the eldest here. I'm the old guy here, but Andrew's, he's catching up with me. Soon he'll pass me. I think that we are evidence that sticking with some of these kind of social justice issues, if we can stick with it, if we have the capacity, we get a job, we can pay the rent, it does have an impact. And the fact that, and the visibility that people who are activists in these areas provide gives hope to other people. And so it may not look like the whole world is changing, but I think that there is that possibility. So, Andrew.
Yeah, there's two ways to interpret this question, and maybe it was intended in both ways. One is around the role of universities in terms of addressing issues of social inequality writ large, which certainly Bud's comments spoke to. The other is talking about the role of universities in the actual admission of students. And I don't want to go from being a prophet of doom, which I might be accused of earlier on, of being a Pollyanna, but the story in Canada, actually relative to other parts of North America anyways, is pretty good in regard of post-secondary education participation, particularly if we don't just think of universities. If we think of the post-secondary system in Canada, which includes community colleges and institutes and teaching universities, there's a higher participation rate on the part of students in Canada than in almost any other OECD country. And while it's true what Bud says, we don't focus on class as a subject matter for research and inquiry and activism to the extent that I believe we should. It is also true that the funding within universities and by governments is very much associated with income levels. So in fact, while tuition rates have gone up and do pose a concern and a barrier to many, by and large, between federal, provincial, and university-based programs, there are pretty good supports for students who have limited or no means relative to other countries, which support those participation rates. And I think there's a growing commitment. I'll give a big shout out to my successor at SFU, Joy Johnson, around equity, diversity, and inclusion as being a central focus of the university. And while equity may not be quite the same thing as class, I know when she uses that term, at least, she's thinking very much of those of limited financial means, as well as those who are excluded for a whole range of other racial, social, and other reasons. So actually, again, we shouldn't be complacent, but I think Canadian universities and post-secondary institutions, that we use that larger category, are relatively well positioned, and we need, of course, to do more, as we always do. But I've been encouraged by some of the philanthropy lately that's been given to support students of limited means two major scholarships in this province that were specifically targeted, not on the traditional, let's give money to those students who are most academically excellent, as important as that may be, but the BD Luminaries program and the Lance Ugla contribution at SFU, which I think over $30 million, all targeted at supporting students of limited means to make sure that they can pursue education. So I think there is some reason to be hopeful here.
Thank you, Andrew. Would any of our other speakers like to comment? Okay, well, thank you very much for your insightful and thoughtful responses and for the questions put forward by the presenters. I'd like to now turn things to Oliver for closing comments.
Thank you for the fabulous discussion. But as you said, it needs persistence. It needs, the energy to keep this file moving. And I think you've been a real champion of community engagement. And this magnificent and timely book is just one more stepping stone in, reminding us what research, what the university can be in promoting a more democratic, inclusive society. So thank you all for having contributed to this book, and Bud for his leadership, and we definitely look very much forward to hearing more from the UNESCO chair at the Center for Global Studies in your endeavors in promoting this. Andrew, thank you very much for your observations, your comments, greatly appreciated, and Kathy for leading us through this discussion. But let me also take this opportunity to thank the crew at the Center for Global Studies, Maeva Gauthier, who has been coordinizing this event, and Stephanie, who made sure that everybody was at the right time at the right place and being able to use this. So Stephanie, thanks for it went very smoothly, and Jody for helping us set this up at the Center for Global Studies. So with this, I think we started a conversation that clearly is an ongoing challenge and issue at the university, but I think you've really given us some vision and some wonderful ideas of how to move forward. And I think all of us on this panel here feel quite passionate about the agenda and trying to find new avenues for promoting community research. But Andrew, thank you for your sobering thoughts on that. This can also be a token, right? It can be not very substantial in its commitment. So in this respect, keep on pushing these limitations and thinking creatively and radically about what this form of community-based research can achieve. With this, let me thank you and bring this session to an end.